You know how sometimes just like one little phrase can set off like a whole firestorm of conversation?
Hmm.
That's what happened with this J.D. Vance RNC speech.
Right.
He just throws out this term, shared history.
Yeah.
And suddenly it's like this certain corner of the internet just goes nuts.
Yeah.
Turns out that phrase, it was like a dog whistle to this group that calls themselves the TheoBros.
Yeah, it is interesting to see how this group has really captured the attention of this very specific segment of like conservative America.
For those of us who maybe aren't as familiar, like paint us a picture. Who are we talking about when we say TheoBros?
Okay, so imagine like the opposite of your stereotypical, like old school evangelicals.
Okay.
These are young, internet savvy, and their version of Christianity, it's like way more extreme. We're talking about like replacing the U.S. Constitution with the Ten Commandments level of extreme.
Wow. Okay, so not exactly your Sunday school teacher's Christianity then.
Not at all.
Yeah.
No. They believe that America should be a theocracy, a nation ruled by God's law, or at least their interpretation of it.
Right.
And this worldview, it kind of bleeds into everything for them.
Okay.
From like their disdain for multiculturalism to their attacks on things like Burning Man and even like Taylor Swift.
Oh, and Taylor Swift, what did she do? Release like a pro-secularism album that I missed or something?
It's not so much about like specific actions as it is just anything that falls outside of their very narrow worldview is seen as a threat.
Okay.
And their rhetoric is often very, very harsh. We're talking advocating for things like public floggings, repealing the 19th Amendment.
Repealing the 19th, as in no more voting rights for women. That's pretty extreme, even for like the far right. It makes you wonder, I mean, is this just about shock value, or do they actually believe this stuff?
That is the million-dollar question. And,
Wow.
some people argue it's a calculated strategy just to get attention, to provoke a reaction.
Sure.
Others say it's a sincere, if misguided, desire to return to what they see as a pure form of American society.
Right.
But I think what is clear is that even more traditional religious conservatives, they're starting to like voice their concerns over the growing influence of this group.
Which is really saying something considering how far right the Overton window has already shifted.
Exactly.
But these guys aren't just like internet trolls, right?
No.
This Mother Jones article that you sent me, it mentioned podcasts, conferences. They even have their own mag. It seems like they're pretty organized.
Oh, absolutely. They're incredibly strategic about how they spread their message.
Okay.
It's very much a two-pronged approach. They've got the bottom up and then they've got the top down.
Okay, break that down for me.
All right, so bottom up involves building their own communities,
Okay.
creating these enclaves of like-minded individuals.
Mhm.
The top-down approach focuses on infiltrating institutions of power,
Okay.
influencing policy, and ultimately shaping the nation in their image.
Gotcha.
And at the heart of this movement is a figure named Douglas Wilson. He's often referred to as like the TheoBro patriarch.
Patriarch, that sounds a little ominous.
Yeah, he's a fascinating and controversial figure, to say the least.
Okay.
Despite having some like extremely outdated views on things like slavery and women's roles in society, he's managed to amass a significant following.
This article you shared, it even mentioned him using a flamethrower to destroy symbols of modernity.
Yeah, he definitely has a flair for the dramatic.
Yeah.
But theatrics aside, his influence is undeniable.
Okay.
He's built this like mini empire in Idaho,
Really?
complete with his own church, a school, a publishing house, and of course a very active online presence.
Of course.
And his reach extends far beyond Idaho.
Oh,
He's
sure.
mentored a whole generation of these younger TheoBros who are now spreading his message across the country.
So, like, who gives us some names? Who are we talking about here?
Well, there's Joel Webbin. He's a particularly outspoken figure, seems to really revel in controversy. He's built quite a following with his podcast and his, online rants about the evils of modern society. And his commentary on like the decline of family values often includes some rather interesting takes on things like, you guessed it, Taylor Swift's dating life.
It's always Taylor Swift's fault.
Always.
But it sounds like his strategy is all about drumming up this outrage.
Yes.
Positioning himself as this rebel fighting against the so-called woke agenda, which, let's be honest, is a pretty effective tactic in today's like hyper-polarized climate.
Absolutely. By presenting themselves as the victims of this woke culture war,
Yeah.
they're able to tap into these pre-existing anxieties among certain segments of society.
Right.
And it creates this very clear us versus them mentality.
Right.
And this is where things start to get really interesting in relation to J.D. Vance.
Because on the surface, Vance doesn't seem like the obvious candidate to be influenced by a group like this. I mean, he's Catholic, his wife is Hindu. He's not exactly the poster boy for their brand of like Protestant America.
Which is why the connections are so fascinating.
Right.
Because despite their seemingly different backgrounds, when you look at Vance's inner circle, the people he surrounds himself with, the conferences he attends, you start to see this like surprising amount of overlap with the TheoBro network.
And I'm guessing this isn't just a coincidence.
Not at all. They share funders, they endorse each other's work, and most importantly, their rhetoric, while often more subtly coded, in Vance's case, it often centers around many of the same anxieties and fears that animate the TheoBro movement.
Like what? Give us some specifics.
Well, you see this shared fixation on masculinity, this deep anxiety about declining birth rates among white Americans, and this idea of ethno-nationalism as a way to preserve a very specific cultural and racial identity. And underpinning all of this is this very specific type of misogyny that we see cropping up again and again.
It's like they're speaking in code almost, right? Using this language that resonates with like a very specific audience.
Mm-hmm.
But how effective is this strategy really? Like, can a group like this, with such extreme views, can they actually gain real political power?
That's the question that keeps a lot of people up at night.
Right.
And the answer, unfortunately, is that it's not just possible. It's already happening.
Okay.
I mean, we see it in the rise of politicians like Vance, who, while maybe not explicitly endorsing every single tenet of the TheoBro ideology,
Right.
they're definitely tapping into that same well of anxiety and resentment.
And they're being very strategic about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not just about like fiery speeches and online rants.
No.
They're building institutions, they're creating communities, and they're cultivating relationships with people in positions of power.
Precisely. And this is where someone like Josh Abbotoy comes in.
Okay.
He's another one of these Douglas Wilson proteges.
Right.
But unlike some of the others who are content with just like preaching to the choir, Abbotoy is very much a connector.
Okay.
He's a venture capitalist. He runs this publication called American Reformer.
Right.
And he's got these close ties to the Heritage Foundation.
And for those of us who aren't like political science nerds, remind us why the Heritage Foundation matters in all of this.
Right. So the Heritage Foundation, it's like the mothership of conservative think tanks.
Okay.
They have a huge influence on Republican policy.
Right.
And Abbotoy has been very effective at like injecting these TheoBro ideas into their network. And then there's his involvement with this group called New Founding.
Okay.
And they are buying up land in Appalachia with the goal of creating these like self-sustaining Christian communities.
Wait, so they're literally trying to build their own little theocracies. It sounds
Yeah.
like something out of a dystopian novel.
It does have a certain Handmaid's Tale vibe to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, a little bit.
But they're not really trying to be subtle about it either.
Yeah.
Like they want to create these enclaves where they can live according to their very specific interpretation of God's law,
Right.
free from the influence of what they see as a decadent and corrupt secular society.
Okay.
And they're targeting their message not just at other like hardcore TheoBros, but at like regular everyday Christians who might be feeling disillusioned or left behind by mainstream society.
So they're tapping into this like pre-existing sense of anxiety,
Yeah.
this fear that like traditional values are under attack.
Exactly.
And they're offering a solution. Come join us in our idyllic Christian utopia.
Yeah. It's a very powerful message,
Right.
especially in a time when so many people are feeling uncertain about the future.
Absolutely. And it's not just about fear either.
No.
It's also about belonging,
Yes.
right? They're offering this sense of community, a shared identity,
Mm-hmm.
a purpose in a world that can often feel chaotic and meaningless.
Exactly.
And that's a powerful draw for a lot of people, especially like young people who are searching for something to believe in.
Absolutely.
And it's not just happening in Appalachia, right?
Right.
This article mentioned something about a similar movement gaining traction in places like Utah.
You're thinking of Brian Soff?
Oh,
He's another prominent figure in the TheoBro world,
okay.
and he's building his own little fiefdom out in Utah with a focus on what he calls biblical patriarchy.
Which basically translates to women should be seen and not heard, right?
Yeah, or more accurately, like barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen.
Right, exactly.
You're not far off.
Okay.
Soff is very vocal about his belief that a woman's primary purpose is to be a wife and mother.
All right.
And he has some pretty harsh things to say about women who choose a different path.
Like that quote you highlighted where he basically shames childless women in their 50s,
Yes.
saying they'll regret their irreversible mistake.
It's a very specific kind of misogyny that we see like permeating much of the TheoBro ideology.
Right.
They see traditional gender roles as divinely ordained, and any deviation from that norm is a threat to like the natural order of things.
Right.
But I think what sets Suave apart from some of the others is his very open hostility towards Jews.
Okay.
Like, he often invokes these anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish influence in media and politics,
Right.
which is a concerning escalation that we're seeing more and more within this movement.
It's a reminder that for all their talk of like family values and traditional morality,
Right.
there's this dark undercurrent of bigotry and intolerance running through a lot of this rhetoric.
Yeah.
It's not just about like bringing back prayer in schools. It's about creating a society where certain groups are excluded or relegated to second-class status.
Exactly.
And that's a dangerous path to go down. And it's not just about like relegating women and minorities like off to the sidelines, you know?
Right.
It's about fundamentally reshaping like the very fabric of American society.
Yeah.
Which brings us to Stephen Wolfe and his book, The Case for Christian Nationalism.
Right. Wolf is really interesting because he represents this like more intellectual,
Right.
you could even say like academic strain of this movement.
Yeah, he's not out there like preaching fire and brimstone.
Right.
It's more like, let's have like a calm, reasoned discussion about why America should be a theocracy.
Exactly.
Which is kind of what makes him so dangerous in a way.
Right.
Because he's packaging these like really extreme ideas in this very palatable way.
He's very articulate. He's well-read.
Right.
And he knows how to use the language of like history and political philosophy to make his arguments seem credible.
So how does his vision of like a Christian America actually work in practice?
Yeah.
I mean, does he like lay out a plan?
He does.
Right.
And it's it's pretty chilling.
Yeah.
He argues for a society where the government is explicitly Christian,
Okay.
where the laws reflect like a very specific interpretation of biblical principles.
Right.
And he even suggests that like the Founding Fathers' vision for America actually allows for this kind of like religious dominance.
Wait, so he's trying to claim the Founding Fathers, who were all about religious freedom,
You're right.
would be cool with a theocracy.
Yeah, it's a very selective and distorted reading of history, to say the least.
Right.
But it's a tactic we see time and time again with this movement.
Yeah.
They're masters at reframing and reinterpreting the past to fit their present-day agenda.
And they're not afraid to play the victim card either.
Oh, absolutely not.
It's always, you know, Christians are under attack.
Right.
Our values are being eroded.
Exactly. It's all about creating the siege mentality, this idea that they are the righteous few
Right.
fighting against this tide of secular humanism.
Right. And it's a powerful narrative,
Very much so.
especially when it's being amplified by people with platforms like J.D. Vance.
Absolutely.
So we've got the charismatic leader in Douglas Wilson.
Right.
We've got the media-savvy provocateur in Joel Webben. We've got the community builder in Josh Apatow.
Yeah.
And we've got like the intellectual architect in Stephen Wolfe.
Yeah, it's like they've got all the bases covered.
Yeah, it's like they've got their little starting lineup.
They really do.
And they're all working towards this same goal, which is to transform America from this pluralistic secular democracy into a nation where their very specific interpretation of Christianity reigns supreme.
Exactly.
Which brings us all the way back to that like seemingly innocuous phrase that we started with,
Right.
shared history.
Right, it's a dog whistle.
Right.
It's a way of signaling to a certain audience that you're on the same page, that you share the same values.
Exactly. And in the hands of someone like J.D. Vance, it's a way to kind of mainstream those values.
Yes.
To make them seem less fringe.
Absolutely.
So for those of us who don't subscribe to the TheoBro worldview,
Yeah.
what can we do?
Well, first and foremost, I think we need to be aware.
Okay.
We need to understand the threat that this movement poses to our democracy.
Right.
And we need to be willing to push back against this rhetoric, both in public and in private.
Because silence is complicity, right?
Exactly. We can't afford to be bystanders while these groups chip away at the very foundations of our society.
So what can we do? What are some ways that people can, like, get involved?
Well, we can support organizations that are fighting for religious freedom and separation of church and state.
Okay.
We need to call out bigotry and intolerance wherever we see it. And I think we need to be very vigilant about defending the values of a pluralistic and inclusive society.
Well said. That's really, I think, the takeaway here.
Yeah,
It's a sobering thought,
it is.
but it's a conversation I think we really need to be having.
Absolutely.
Because, like, the future of American democracy might very well depend on it.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, folks, there you have it.
Yes.
A deep dive into the world of the TheoBros, their ideology and their alarming connections to mainstream figures like J.D. Vance. It's a lot to process, but hopefully you're walking away with a better understanding of this growing movement and the threat it poses.
I hope so, too.
As always, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged, because the fight for a just and equitable society is far from over.